In 1880, archaeologists found an inscription engraved in stone inside a tunnel in Jerusalem. The inscription said, "The stone cutters struck axe against axe and the water flowed. But here is the impossible." The tunnel had been excavated through 533 meters of solid rock. Two teams began excavating from opposite points of the hill and met perfectly in the middle, without maps, without measuring instruments, without communication between the teams. Modern engineers with GPS and precision equipment consider this an extreme technical challenge. How people 2,700 years ago managed to calculate the exact trajectory through the rock, and why did they risk their lives excavating in the darkness for months? Why was it so desperately important to bring that water inside the city? The answer lies in the lives of those people. Because while they were excavating that impossible tunnel, something was happening in Jerusalem that made every drop of water a matter of life or death. But when you discover how those people really lived, you will understand that water was only the beginning of their problems. What was it like to wake up in Jerusalem? 4,000 years ago, the rooster crowed, but it was not to warn that the day had begun. It was to warn that you had only 2 hours before the sun became a silent killer in ancient Jerusalem. Waking up was not an option. It was a matter of life or death. Whoever slept late died of thirst, hunger, or sunstroke. And how strange. They lived literally on top of one of the most abundant water sources in the region. The Gihon Spring sprouted crystal-clear water right at the base of the hill where Jerusalem was built. But here is the first mystery. If there was so much water, why did people die of thirst? The answer will shock you. The spring was outside the city walls. To fetch water, you needed to go down a steep path of almost 200 meters, carry heavy ceramic jars, and climb all the way back. A round trip took almost an hour, and you needed to do it several times a day. Women woke up at 4 in the morning to reach the spring first. Why? Because whoever arrived last found cloudy water trampled by the dirty feet of dozens of people, and dirty water meant disease. Disease meant death. But getting water was only the beginning of the nightmare. Returning home meant facing a climb that would leave any adult breathless today. Pregnant women, children, and the elderly often fainted on the way. The lucky ones were helped. The others stayed right there in the sun. When they finally arrived home, another challenge began. Making fire without matches, without a lighter. You needed to rub pieces of wood until creating sparks. The process took between 20 to 30 minutes. If there was wind or rain, you were left without fire. Without fire, there was no cooked food. There was no boiled water. There was no heat during the cold nights. And if someone got sick, there was no doctor in Jerusalem at that time. There were healers who mixed herbs, animal blood, and mystical rituals. Most cures killed faster than the disease itself. That is why everyone woke up early. Because every minute of the day was a battle not to die. But wait until you discover what happened to the women in that city. What they were worth in the market will leave you indignant. Some cost less than a goat, and the reason behind this is even more disturbing. Why were women worth less than a goat? 50 shekels of silver? That was the official price of a virgin wife in Jerusalem 4,000 years ago. A goat cost 100 shekels. You did not read wrong. A woman cost half the price of a goat. And this was not considered absurd. It was divine law recorded in Deuteronomy 22:29. But here it gets strange. If women were so cheap, why could most men not marry? The answer lies in a cruel mathematics. 50 shekels was equivalent to 2 years of hard labor for an ordinary man. Imagine working 2 entire years without spending a single cent on food or clothing, just to save enough money to buy a wife. And there is more. You did not just buy the woman. You bought the right for her to work for you for the rest of her life. Cooking, cleaning, caring for animals, making clothes, giving birth to children. A wife was literally free labor. Therefore, rich men had several wives. It was not lust, it was investment. The more wives, the more free workers you had. King Solomon came to have 700 wives, 700 full-time workers. But what if you were a woman? Your life was decided before you were born. Your father negotiated your marriage when you were still in your mother's womb. You discovered whom you were going to marry on your wedding day, and you could not refuse. If your husband died, you became the property of his brother. It was the law of the levirate, recorded in Deuteronomy 25. 5. You did not choose. You did not have an opinion. You simply changed owners. And if you could not have male children, your husband could return you to your father and ask for the money back as if you were a defective product. This happened to so many women that it became law. Sterile women could be returned within 1 year of marriage. That is why mothers prayed desperately to have male children. A daughter meant loss. You spent money raising her and still had to pay a dowry so that someone would marry her. A son meant profit. He was going to work for you and could even be sold as a slave if necessary. But not every woman accepted this passively. Some found surprising ways to survive and even prosper in this brutal system. Queens, prophetesses, and even prostitutes who changed the course of history. However, what you are going to discover about the children of that time will leave you even more shocked. Because if adult women were worth less than goats, children were worth less than well. You will discover in the next chapter, and it is much worse than you imagine. A 6-year-old child carried stones of 10 kilograms under the midday sun. Their hands bled. Their feet were cracked, and this was considered normal. If you thought women had a difficult life in Jerusalem 4,000 years ago, wait until you discover what happened to the children. Because childhood, as you know it, simply did not exist. Think of a child today. They go to school. They play. They watch cartoons. They have toys. Their only responsibility is to grow up healthy. Now forget all that. In ancient Jerusalem, a child was seen as a small adult who had not yet developed enough strength to work well. At 3 years of age, children already shepherded goats alone in the field. They spent entire days away from home, facing wolves, snakes, and bandits. If they lost a goat, they were beaten until they bled. If they returned home hungry because they shared the food with the goats, they were beaten again. Girls began even earlier. At 2 years, they already carried water in small jars. At 4, they cooked simple meals. At 6, they knew how to spin, weave, and care for babies. It was not a game of house. It was training to become efficient wives. And here comes the part that will shock you. Children were the property of the parents in the most literal sense possible. Exodus 21:7 allowed parents to sell their daughters as slaves. Leviticus 27 established the official price. Boys from 5 to 20 years old were worth 20 shekels. Girls of the same age were worth 10 shekels. That is right. A girl was worth half the price of a boy, and both were worth less than an adult ox. It cost 50 shekels. But why would parents sell their own children? Because of hunger. When there was not enough food for the whole family, parents needed to choose. Everyone died of hunger, or some children were sold to save the rest of the family. It was a desperate mathematics of survival. 2 Kings 4. 1 tells the real story of a widow whose children were about to be taken as slaves to pay debts. This was not fiction. It was daily reality. And if a child got sick, there was no pediatrician. There was no children's hospital. The infant mortality rate was absurd. About 60% of children died before the age of 5. That is why families had many children. It was not by choice. It was by statistical necessity. Parents knew that they would probably lose half of their children before they grew up. So they had 8 children, hoping that 4 would survive. It was a brutal but effective strategy. Now you can understand why having a job at that time was literally a matter of life or death. Because whoever did not work died, and that included children of 6 years old carrying stones until their small bodies could not take it anymore. The oldest man in the city was 35 years old. His hair was white, his back curved, his hands deformed, and he was considered a respectable elder. The life expectancy in Jerusalem 4,000 years ago revolved between 25 and 30 years. It was not for lack of modern medicine. It was because of the type of work that people did to survive. Think of the heaviest work you have ever seen. Now multiply it by 10 and imagine doing it every day without rest, without vacations, without retirement, until you die. That is how it worked. There was no office. There was no commerce as we know it today. Jerusalem was a city built on stones, surrounded by desert, far from navigable rivers. How did people make a living in a place like that? The answer is in the hands. Literally, all work was manual. And when I say manual, it is in the most brutal sense possible. Stonecutters carried blocks of stone from 50 to 100 kilograms on their backs. They went up and down steep slopes dozens of times per day. Their columns crumbled before the age of 25. Most died crushed by stones that lost control on the way down. Farmers had a different but equally deadly problem. They needed to transform rocky soil into arable land using only wooden hoes with iron tips. Every square meter of arable land cost months of work, and if it did not rain at the right time, they lost everything and died of hunger. But there was an even worse job. Being a potter seems harmless, but think about it well. They needed to dig clay with their hands, carry it in heavy baskets, tread on it for hours to soften it, mold each vessel manually, and burn them in kilns that reached 800 degrees Celsius. The heat was so intense that many fainted and fell inside the kiln itself. And for women, their work was equally brutal. Grinding wheat to make flour meant spending hours kneeling, pushing heavy stones in a circular motion. This destroyed the knees and the spine. Many remained permanently curved before the age of 20. Weaving clothes seems delicate, but it was not. It needed to spin the cotton or linen, twisting fibers with the fingers for 12 to 14 hours a day. This deformed the hands irreversibly. Twisted fingers and swollen joints were a trademark of all married women. Here comes the most shocking detail. There was no retirement. You worked until you died. Literally, when your strength was gone. You became a burden to the family, and families did not have resources to maintain people who did not produce. That is why 1 Timothy 5:4 commands that children care for elderly parents. It was not kindness. It was a legal obligation, because if the children did not care, the parents died abandoned. And if you became rich, well, there another type of problem began. Because in ancient Jerusalem, being rich meant having enemies, and enemies meant danger of death at any moment, especially at mealtime. They ate locusts and considered them a special delicacy. Leviticus 11:22 lists exactly which insects the Israelites could eat. Locusts, crickets, and grasshoppers. John the Baptist lived eating locusts and wild honey in the desert, according to Matthew 3:4. It was not desperation. It was a normal menu. But here is something strange. If locusts were permitted food, why did the Bible need to give such a detailed list of what could and could not be eaten? The answer will surprise you. In Jerusalem 4,000 years ago, hunger was a constant reality. Deuteronomy 28:53 describes a siege where people ate their own children. This is not a metaphor. 2 Kings 6:28-29 relates a real conversation between two women who did exactly that during the siege of Samaria. That is why God had to create specific dietary rules. It was not a religious whim. It was a matter of survival. Some foods killed faster than hunger. Pork was forbidden for the simple reason that undercooked pork transmitted fatal diseases, without refrigeration, without thermometers, without knowledge about bacteria. Eating pork was Russian roulette. Leviticus 11:7 simply said, "Or do not eat." The rabbit was also on the forbidden list. Leviticus 11:6 explains that the rabbit chews the cud, but does not have a divided hoof. It seems like nonsense, but it is not. Rabbits carry tularemia, a disease that kills humans quickly. The rule of the divided hoof was a food safety filter. But what about when there was permitted food? Then another problem began. Distribution. The Bible established a social system based on food that may seem strange today. Leviticus 19:9-10 commanded that farmers leave corners of the plantation unharvested. This was so that widows, orphans, and foreigners could collect. It was not charity. It was law. Whoever did not follow was punished. Ruth 2:23 shows this system working in practice. Ruth went to collect ears of corn that were left over from Boaz's harvest. She was not begging. She was exercising a legal right. And here comes the fascinating detail. Honey was more valuable than gold. Proverbs 24:13 compares wisdom with honey, indicating that it was the most precious sweet available. Why? Because sugar did not exist. Wild honey was the only source of concentrated sweet. 1 Samuel 14:27 tells that Jonathan dipped a rod in honey, and immediately his eyes brightened. Honey gave instant energy to exhausted soldiers. It was human fuel in its pure state. But not everyone could eat honey when they wanted. It was so expensive that Proverbs 25:16 warns, "If you found honey, eat just enough so as not to vomit." Eating too much honey was not gluttony. It was economic waste. Now imagine living in a society where even the sweet could kill you by economic overdose, where insects were considered refined food, and where death by starvation was so common that there were specific laws regulating cannibalism in extreme situations. Abraham died at 175 years old, Isaac at 180, Jacob at 147, Moses at 120, and after them something changed drastically. Psalm 90:10, written by Moses, says that the duration of human life is 70 years or 80 for the strongest. What happened between the patriarchs and the time of ancient Jerusalem that shortened human life by half? The answer is in Genesis 6:3. God said, "My spirit shall not remain in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. It was a divine decree of progressive reduction of human longevity. But in Jerusalem 4,000 years ago, even those 70-80 years were a luxury for few. Most died much earlier, and the way they died reveals how they lived. Genesis 35:18 tells that Rachel died in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin. This was not an exception. It was the rule. Childbirth was one of the main causes of female death. Women knew that each pregnancy could be the last. Therefore, 1 Timothy 2:15 says that women will be saved by giving birth to children. It was not abstract theology. It was recognition that they risked their lives every time they became pregnant. And when someone died, a ritual began that may seem strange today. Genesis 50:3 describes that Joseph ordered to embalm his father Jacob, and the process took 40 days. Then there were 70 days of mourning in Egypt. But that type of embalming was a royal privilege. Ordinary people had few hours between death and burial. John 11:17 mentions that Lazarus had been dead for 4 days when Jesus arrived, and Martha said, "Lord, he already smells bad." Without refrigeration, without chemicals, bodies decomposed quickly in the heat of the Middle East. Therefore, Deuteronomy 21:23 ordered that even bodies of executed criminals be buried the same day. And here comes something that will shock you. Not everyone had the right to a dignified burial. Jeremiah 16:4 prophecies that some would die of diseases, would not be mourned or buried, but would be like dung on the ground. This happened with criminals, traitors, and very poor people. Their families did not have money to buy burial ground, nor resources to make a tomb. 2 Kings 23:6 mentions graves of the common people, which were mass graves where the poor were buried one on top of another. The rich had tombs excavated in rock, like that of Joseph of Arimathea, where Jesus was buried according to Matthew 27:60. The poor had only shallow holes in the ground when they were lucky. And what happened to the assets of those who died? Numbers 27:8-11 establishes the order of inheritance. Male sons first, then daughters, then brothers, then near relatives. Women only inherited if there were no men in the family. That is why widows were so vulnerable. Deuteronomy 10:18 and Psalm 68. 5 mention God as a special protector of widows, because society abandoned them completely. Life in Jerusalem 4,000 years ago was a race against death that most lost young, and whoever survived discovered that dying with dignity was also a privilege of few.